A poor girl saves a man at the foot of the mountain. You aware he's a billionaire changes her life. The wind. The wind howled through the valley, carrying a biting chill as snowflakes whipped through the air. Emily Dawson trudged through the deep snow, her boots sinking with each step. Her thin, worn-out coat did little to keep out the cold, and she shivered as she tightened it around herself. The sky was an ominous shade of gray, warning of an approaching blizzard. She had ventured farther than usual from her cabin, desperate to gather enough firewood before nightfall. The forest at the mountain's base was eerily silent, aside from the wind pushing against the towering pines. Adjusting the axe on her back, she exhaled, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. Then, she heard something, a faint, muffled groan. Emily froze, her heart pounding. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then it came again, weak and filled with pain. She quickly scanned the snow-covered landscape, her pulse quickening. The sound was close, but the howling wind made it impossible to pinpoint. "Hello," she called out, her voice uncertain. No response. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing forward. Something was wrong. Someone needed help. Moving cautiously, her boots crunched against the icy ground. Then, through the thick layer of snow, she noticed an unusual shape, dark, barely visible beneath a mound of white. Her stomach clenched. She rushed forward and fell to her knees, brushing away the snow. Her breath caught when she saw the man's face, pale, his dark hair frozen at the edges. His expensive clothes were torn and soaked, his lips nearly blue, and his half-closed eyes looked empty. "Hey, can you hear me?" Emily shook his shoulder, but he barely reacted. "Sir, wake up." A weak groan escaped his lips, his fingers twitching slightly, barely fighting off the cold's grip. Emily leaned in closer. "You need to wake up. If you stay out here, you'll die." His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse whisper. "Help." Emily clenched her jaw, quickly assessing his condition. His leg was twisted unnaturally, blood staining the snow beneath him. A broken leg in this freezing weather. He wouldn't survive much longer. Cursing under her breath, she grabbed his arm and tried to pull him up. He was heavier than she expected, completely limp against the snow. "Come on," she muttered, gritting her teeth as she shifted his arm over her shoulder. "I'm not leaving you here." With all the strength she could muster, she heaved him up, nearly stumbling under his weight. Every step was a battle against the deep snow and the unforgiving wind. The man groaned in pain, his head lolling against her shoulder, but she pressed on. She had no idea who he was or how he ended up here, but that didn't matter right now. The only thing that mattered was getting him to safety before the cold took him forever. Emily pushed through the storm, each step harder than the last. Her limbs ached, her body numb from the cold, but she refused to stop. The man's breath was shallow, his body lifeless against hers. She tightened her grip around him, determined not to fail. By the time she reached her cabin, exhaustion weighed her down, but she didn't let go. She kicked the door open and nearly collapsed as she dragged him inside. The warmth hit her instantly, a stark contrast to the freezing wilderness outside. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. With great effort, she maneuvered him onto the old couch near the fireplace. His skin was ice cold, his fingers stiff with frostbite. Acting quickly, she grabbed a pile of blankets and wrapped them around him, kneeling beside him to check his injuries. Even unconscious, his sharp features were striking. His expensive coat, though ruined by the cold and blood, hinted at a life far removed from this harsh, isolated place. Whoever he was, one thing was clear. This man wasn't just lost in the snow. Something bigger had led him here, straight into her path. Emily's fingers trembled as she touched the fabric, now stiff with frozen blood. Her eyes landed on his leg. A deep gash ran along his shin, the wound raw and angry against his pale skin. She muttered a quiet curse under her breath. If it got infected, he wouldn't make it. She worked fast, hands steady despite the urgency. Using warm water, she cleaned the wound, wincing at the sight of the deep cut. He stirred slightly, a faint groan slipping past his lips, but he didn't wake. Once she wrapped his leg tightly in fresh bandages, she let out a slow breath. Now, all she could do was wait. Hours dragged by. Emily sat in the old wooden chair across from the couch, watching the man with wary eyes. His breathing had steadied, his face no longer deathly pale. The firelight cast soft shadows over his features, highlighting the rough stubble on his jaw and the strong lines of his face. He didn't look like a local. Who was he? And what the hell had he been doing alone in the middle of nowhere? Just as her mind swirled with questions, a hoarse voice broke the silence. "Where am I?" Emily shot up, moving closer. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing stormy gray eyes that darted around the room in confusion. "You're in my cabin," she said, keeping her voice firm but calm. "I found you half dead in snow." He groaned, his hand moving to his temple as if trying to piece together his thoughts. I don't remember." Emily narrowed her eyes. "What's your name?" He hesitated, blinking against the flickering firelight. After a long pause, he rasped, Richard Caldwell." Something about that name stirred a distant familiarity in her, but she couldn't place it. "You were in bad shape when I found you," she said, crossing her arms. "Your leg was messed up, and you had no supplies. No proper gear. What happened to you?" Richard exhaled sharply and struggled to sit up. A flash of pain crossed his face as he clutched his bandaged leg. I don't know. I remember the cold, the storm, then nothing." Frustration darkened his features. Everything else is a blur. Emily studied him carefully. Was he lying? Or was he really that confused? Either way, something about his story didn't sit right with her. Then his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "My phone," he muttered, patting the pockets of his torn coat. "My wallet, where the hell?" Emily's stomach tightened. "They weren't on you when I found you." Richard's jaw clenched. No, I had them. I remember. I had my phone, my wallet, my watch. They're gone." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily had seen enough to know what that meant. Someone had taken his things, and in a place as unforgiving as the Alaskan wilderness. That didn't happen by accident. "You think someone robbed you?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Seems like the only explanation, doesn't it?" Emily frowned. If someone had left him out there to die, it meant whoever did this wanted him gone. But why? She glanced at the fire, the flames flickering as if mirroring her thoughts. Richard Caldwell, a man in expensive clothes, with sharp eyes and no memory of how he ended up half frozen on the mountain. Something about him didn't add up. And yet, despite the uneasy feeling curling in her stomach, she couldn't turn him away. Not yet. Morning light filtered through the frosted window panes, casting a pale glow over the small wooden cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only embers crackling softly in the quiet. Moving about the cabin with practiced efficiency, Emily layered more wood into the stove and set a kettle over the flames. The air smelled of pine and the faint scent of smoked meat, a humble but familiar aroma in this house. Behind her, the sound of rustling blankets made her turn. Richard was stirring, his movements slow and stiff. He winced as he adjusted his injured leg, his face still pale with exhaustion, but his sharp gray eyes flicked toward her, more alert than the night before. "You're awake," she said, setting down the tin cup she had been holding. He gave a small nod, running a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the remnants of a nightmare. "Yeah, I guess I owe you a thank you for not leaving me out there." Emily scoffed, pouring hot water into the tin cup and walking over to him. "You'd be frozen solid if I had." She handed him the cup. "Drink. It'll help warm you up." Richard hesitated, eyeing the steaming liquid. "What is it?" "Pine needle tea." She smirked at his doubtful expression. "You don't have much choice, city boy. It's either that or freeze." At the word city boy, Richard gave her a bemused look, but said nothing. He lifted the cup to his lips, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste, but he drank it nonetheless. Just then, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stepped inside, wrapped in thick furs. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto Richard with a calculating gaze. "So, this is the stranger you dragged in from the snow," she said, her voice lined with both curiosity and something else, something Emily couldn't quite place. Emily stood firm, her expression unreadable. "Grandma, this is Richard." "Richard, this is Martha Dawson." Richard nodded, shifting uncomfortably as he tried to sit up straighter. "Mom." Martha barely reacted, stepping closer to examine him with a critical eye before turning to Emily. "He shouldn't be here." Emily crossed her arms. "I couldn't just leave him to die." Martha sighed, untying her fur-lined hood. "You're too soft-hearted, child. Strangers bring trouble." Emily clenched her jaw, but didn't argue. She knew Martha wasn't heartless, just cautious. Life in Alaska had made her that way. But Emily had already made up her mind. He stays until he's strong enough to leave. Martha exhaled sharply, clearly unconvinced, but said nothing more. Instead, she walked to the stove and began preparing breakfast, her movements slow but deliberate. Richard watched in silence, taking in the small but sturdy cabin. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved food. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a few old hunting rifles rested near the door, their wooden stocks worn smooth from years of use. Despite its simplicity, the cabin was warm, not just in temperature, but in the quiet understanding between grandmother and granddaughter. The smell of food filled the air, making Richard's stomach twist painfully. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. Emily caught his expression and smirked. "Haven't eaten in a while, have you?" "Not since." He frowned. "I don't actually remember." "Well, you're in luck. Breakfast is almost ready." A few minutes later, Martha set 3 wooden bowls on the table. Inside was a thick stew made of dried venison, root vegetables, and wild herbs. It was simple, rustic food, but it smelled incredible. Richard hesitated before picking up the wooden spoon and taking a bite. The stew was rich, the deep, earthy flavors warming him from the inside out. It was nothing like the refined meals of 5-star restaurants or the processed food of city life. This was real, unpretentious, nourishing, and satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with money. He glanced at Emily, who ate with quiet efficiency, seemingly treating every task the same way. "You live like this every day." She looked up. "Like what?" "Hunting for food, making your own medicine, chopping wood just to stay warm." She shrugged. "Yeah, it's not easy, but it's life." Richard stirred his stew absently. "I don't think I've ever had to work that hard for anything." Martha snorted. "Doesn't surprise me." Richard chuckled under his breath. "I bet." Emily watched him for a moment. He clearly didn't belong here. Yet, something about the way he studied his food, as if reconsidering everything he'd known, made her wonder. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he seemed. The days passed slowly in the Dawson cabin, marked by the steady crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. Richard was regaining his strength, though his injured leg still limited his movement. Despite the discomfort, he found an odd sense of peace in the cabin's quiet simplicity. Emily was always busy, chopping wood, checking traps, preparing food, tending to her grandmother. She never complained, never hesitated to get her hands dirty. Richard had never met anyone like her before. One evening, as the fire flickered in the hearth, Richard stretched his sore limbs. Emily sat at the wooden table, carefully sewing a tear in her coat. The room smelled of pine and smoke, since Richard had come to associate with safety. "I need to tell you something," he said, breaking the silence. Emily didn't look up. "You're not secretly a murderer, are you?" Richard let out a short laugh. "No, but I am rich." That made her glance up, one eyebrow raised. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "My full name is Richard Caldwell. I own a company called Caldwell Enterprises. We specialize in real estate and private investments. I have offices in New York, London, and Tokyo." Emily blinked. "Okay." Richard waited for more. A reaction, some kind of shock or curiosity. But she just shrugged and went back to sewing. "That's it?" he asked, incredulous. She didn't even look at him this time. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, gesturing vaguely. Most people would be a little more surprised. Emily tied off her thread, biting it between her teeth before meeting his gaze. "It doesn't change anything." Richard stared at her, baffled. "You're telling me you don't care at all?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Look, Richard, Maybe in your world, money means everything. But here, it won't light a fire. It won't feed you. And it sure as hell won't save you when you're half dead in a snowstorm. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. Out there, you might be some big-shot millionaire, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the world beyond the cabin walls. But here, you're just a guy who got lost in the snow. The words hit harder than he expected. His entire life, people had treated him differently because of his wealth, his employees, his so-called friends, even the women he dated. He was used to a world where money meant power, where his name alone commanded respect. But Emily? She didn't give a damn. For the first time in his life, Richard felt something unfamiliar, humility. He leaned back against the couch, staring into the fire, his thoughts tangled. Unfazed, Emily stood and stretched. I'm going to bed. Try not to overthink it too much, city boy. Richard watched her disappear into the small adjoining room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been living his entire life wrong. The morning air was crisp and biting, thick with the scent of pine and fresh snow. Richard stepped out of the cabin, leaning against the wooden railing as he took in the endless expanse of wilderness before him. Towering mountains stood against the horizon, their peaks dusted in white. The sky stretched pale blue above the rugged peaks, their snow-dusted summits untouched by time. It was a view unlike anything Richard had ever seen in New York, a world ruled not by men in suits, but by nature itself. Emily stepped out from the side of the cabin, an old axe resting against her shoulder. She glanced at him, then at the pile of firewood stacked near the door. If you're going to stand there all day, at least make yourself useful, she said, tossing him a pair of gloves. Richard barely caught them before they hit his chest. Chopping wood? Seriously, Emily smirked. Unless you'd rather freeze tonight. With a sigh, Richard pulled on the gloves. He had spent his life negotiating billion-dollar deals and managing entire corporations. He had never chopped a single log in his life. But as he followed Emily to the clearing behind the cabin, something inside him shifted. He actually wanted to try. At first, he was terrible. The axe was heavier than he expected, and every swing barely dented the wood. Emily stood with her arms crossed, barely holding back a grin. You don't have to hit it like it insulted your stock portfolio, she teased. Richard groaned, wiping sweat from his brow. Maybe you should just do it. Nope. She stepped closer. Here, adjust your grip. Stand like this. She positioned his hands on the wooden handle and guided his stance. Her fingers were rough but warm, steadying his movements. Richard found himself momentarily distracted by the way the sunlight caught strands of her wind-tousled hair. Now try again, she said. He swallowed hard and focused. This time, when he swung, the log split cleanly in two. Emily grinned. There you go. Richard stared at the broken pieces, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Maybe there was something to this whole working with your hands thing after all. Days passed, and Richard started to adapt. He helped Emily with small tasks, fetching water from a frozen stream, patching up the old cabin roof, even setting snares in the forest. His sharp suits and polished shoes had been replaced by thick woolen clothes borrowed from Emily's grandfather's old trunk. His hands, once used only for signing contracts, grew rough from labor, and for some reason, he didn't hate it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Emily handed him a bow. You're going to teach me how to hunt now. Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily smirked. You want to eat, don't you? He shook his head with a sigh. Fine, but if I die doing this, you're telling my board of directors it was your fault. Emily just laughed. The next morning, they moved quietly through the forest, the air crisp with the scent of pine. Richard tried to step as lightly as Emily, but she moved like a ghost, silent and deliberate. He, on the other hand, snapped every twig in his path. They tracked a rabbit for nearly an hour. When the moment came, Emily nudged him. All right, city boy, take your shot. Richard hesitated, gripping the bowstring. The rabbit twitched its ears, sensing danger. You hesitate, you lose, Emily whispered. He exhaled slowly and released the arrow. It missed by a mile. Emily winced. Okay, That was painful to watch. Richard groaned, rubbing his forehead. Maybe I should stick to real estate. She laughed. Come on, we'll try again later. That afternoon, as they headed back to the cabin, something changed. The birds stopped chirping. The wind stilled. Emily froze. Richard frowned. What is it? A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the trees. Richard's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned, just in time to see the massive grizzly emerge from the underbrush. Its dark eyes locked onto them, muscles tensing. It was close. Too close. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt fear like this before. Emily reacted first. Slowly move back, she whispered. He obeyed, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. But the bear stepped forward, its massive paws crunching the snow. Then, suddenly, it charged. Richard barely had time to react before Emily grabbed his arm and shoved him behind a tree. In one swift motion, she raised her rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the bullet shattered the silence. The bear skidded to a stop, ears flattening. It hesitated, let out a final huff, then turned and lumbered back into the woods. Richard pressed against the tree, struggling to breathe. His hand shook. Emily lowered her gun, exhaling slowly. That, Richard panted, was the single most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Emily smirked, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. Welcome to Alaska. He let out a breathless laugh, still trying to steady his nerves. But something had changed. Emily had risked her life for him, without hesitation, without thinking twice. No one had ever done that for him before. Not his business partners, not the women he had dated, not even the people he called friends. But Emily, this woman who barely knew him, had saved his life. And in that moment, Richard Caldwell, Billionaire CEO, realized something. All the money in the world meant nothing compared to this. The fire crackled softly in the cabin as Richard sat at the wooden table, staring at his hands. Outside, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the shutters. But he barely noticed, his mind piecing together fragments of memory. Emily sat across from him, sipping her tea, watching him with quiet curiosity. You look like a man who's just figured something out. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I think I know why I was out there. Why I nearly died. She set her cup down. Go on. He took a slow breath. Before I woke up in the snow, I was in Alaska for a business meeting. My company, Caldwell Enterprises, was negotiating a deal to acquire a mining operation, a gold mine. Emily's expression darkened. Let me guess. The deal wasn't exactly clean. Richard hesitated. He had never thought much about the morality of his business deals before. He had people for that. But now, sitting in this cabin, seeing the world through Emily's eyes, things felt different. The negotiations were intense, he admitted. Not everyone wanted me to get control of the mine. There were competitors, people who stood to gain if I disappeared. Emily leaned forward. You think someone tried to get rid of you? His jaw tightened. Not just someone. I think it was my own assistant. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Jonathan Reed, his right-hand man, the one who handled his schedule, his travel, his security, the person he trusted most, and the last person he had seen before waking up in the snow. Jonathan poured Richard a drink, his expression smooth and confident. By this time tomorrow, the mine will be yours. Richard took the glass, nodding. Good. I don't want any surprises. Jonathan smirked. Of course. You can always trust me. Then darkness. A sharp pain in his skull. A bitter taste in his mouth. The sting of ice against his skin. The blinding white of the snow. Richard clenched his fists. He drugged me. Left me out there knowing I wouldn't survive. Asterisk asterisk, by the time they declared him missing, the deal would already be signed without him. Emily's expression hardened. So he tried to kill you for money. Richard let out a bitter laugh. That's the world I come from. Disgust flashed in Emily's green eyes. Unbelievable. And to think you actually trusted this guy. Richard exhaled slowly. Yeah, I did. Running a hand through his hair, his jaw tightened. I can't let him get away with this. Emily studied him for a long moment. So what are you going to do? Richard looked up, his gray eyes dark with determination. I have to go back. Silence settled between them. Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Right, of course. Go back to your world of power and money. Richard frowned. I don't have a choice. If I don't stop him, he'll take everything I built. He'll win. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. And then what? You fix your business, put the bad guy in jail, and go back to your fancy penthouse in New York. Richard hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't let this betrayal stand. But as he looked at Emily and the life he had come to respect in ways he never expected, a strange unease settled in his chest. Emily sighed, shaking her head. Look, I get it. You have unfinished business. Just don't forget what you learned here. Richard met her gaze. For the first time, he realized, he didn't want to leave. Not really. Reaching across the table. His fingers brushed against hers. I will come back. Emily searched his face for any sign of a lie. Then she nodded once. You better. And for the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell knew he had something worth coming back for. The day Richard left, the sky was a dull gray, thick clouds rolling over the mountains like a heavy curtain. The air felt colder than usual, or maybe it only felt that way to Emily as she stood outside the cabin, watching him prepare to leave. He was dressed in borrowed winter gear, bundled against the elements, but something about him already looked different, like he didn't quite belong here anymore. His injured leg had healed enough for him to travel, though he still moved with a slight limp. The sled dogs barked restlessly, eager to be on their way. Emily crossed her arms, keeping her expression neutral. You sure you're ready for this, city boy? Richard smirked, though there was something sad in his eyes. I don't think I have a choice. She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud in the freezing air. I guess not. Martha, standing a few feet away, gave Richard a hard look. Be careful out there, boy. The world ain't as forgiving as this place. Richard nodded. I know. He turned back to Emily, hesitating. There were a million things he wanted to say, but none of them felt right. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into her hand. A silver compass, worn with age. Emily frowned. What's this? My grandfather's, Richard said. He used to say it would always point him home. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. And where's home for you? Richard hesitated, then softly. I don't know yet. Emily swallowed hard, curling her fingers around the compass. You better figure it out. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Richard took a step back and climbed onto the sled. With a sharp command, the dogs lurched forward, kicking up a flurry of snow. Emily stood there, unmoving, watching as he disappeared into the white horizon. And for the first time since she was a child, she felt something strange, something that scared her more than any storm. She missed him. The weeks passed slowly. Emily threw herself into work, hunting, chopping wood, fixing whatever needed fixing. She told herself she didn't care that Richard hadn't sent word, but every morning she found herself glancing toward the trail he had left on, and every night she turned the small silver compass over in her fingers, as if it held some kind of answer. Martha noticed, of course. He's not coming back, her grandmother said one evening, stirring a pot of stew over the fire. Emily didn't look up. I never said he was. Martha sighed, shaking her head. You like him? Emily scoffed. Doesn't matter if I do. He has his world. I have mine. Martha studied her for a long moment. And what if his world isn't what he wants anymore? Emily didn't have an answer for that. Then, one evening, everything changed. Emily was outside stacking firewood when she heard the distant sound of sled dogs approaching. She turned, expecting one of the village traders. Instead, a man she had never seen before stepped off the sled. He was tall, dressed in a heavy coat lined with fur. His face was sharp, carrying the air of someone who didn't belong in these parts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Miss Dawson, he asked. Emily nodded slowly. The man extended the letter. This is from Richard Caldwell. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She hesitated before reaching out to take it. taking the envelope, the stiff, cold paper pressed against her fingers. The man gave her a small nod. "He's waiting for you." Emily's breath hitched. Richard hadn't forgotten her. And now, for the first time, the choice was hers. Where did she truly belong? She had never seen anything like this before. New York City stretched endlessly before her, alive and pulsing with energy. Skyscrapers loomed high, their glass facades reflecting the bright city lights. People rushed through the streets like currents in a river. Car horns blared. Billboards flashed. It was overwhelming. She tightened her grip on the small silver compass in her pocket, the only piece of her past she had carried with her. The sleek black car that had picked her up from the airport wove through the chaos until it finally pulled up in front of an extravagant hotel. The doorman opened her door with a polite nod, but Emily barely noticed. She was too busy staring up at the towering glass structure. Was this really where Richard lived? The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, except for the distant hum of the city below. Then, with a soft chime, the door slid open. Richard was waiting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked different, polished in a tailored suit, clean-shaven, every bit the billionaire he had always been. But his eyes, they were different. There was something softer there, something she hadn't seen when they first met. "Emily," he said, stepping forward. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand firm. "You wrote to me." He exhaled, nodding. "I told you I'd come back when I realized I couldn't. So I brought you to me." Emily glanced around the penthouse, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, a world of wealth and power she had never belonged to. Richard must have sensed her hesitation because he stepped closer. "I know it's a lot," he admitted, "but I didn't bring you here to impress you." She crossed her arms. "Then why am I here?" He took a slow breath. "Because I needed you to see who I used to be and who I'm trying to become." Over the next few days, Emily saw just how much Richard had changed. He had fired Jonathan Reed, pressed charges, and taken back control of his company. But beyond that, he had started something new, a foundation, the Dawson Initiative. Richard explained one evening over dinner. It's a nonprofit dedicated to helping people in rural communities, especially places like Alaska. Infrastructure, medical aid, education, real, lasting change. Emily blinked. "You named it after me?" Richard smiled. "I wouldn't be here without you." She studied his face, searching for any sign that this was just another business move. But all she saw was sincerity, raw, undeniable sincerity. One night, as they walked along the edge of Central Park, Richard finally said the words she had been waiting for. "I love you, Emily." Her breath caught as he reached for her hands. His grip warmed despite the cold air. "I don't care about the money, the company, none of it matters. I just want you." Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't answer right away. She had seen powerful men make promises before. Words were easy. Actions were what mattered. So instead, she met his gaze and said, "If you love me, Richard, then prove it." His brows furrowed. "How?" She held up the compass. "Find your way home." Weeks passed. Emily returned to Alaska, unsure if Richard would follow. But he did. Not with private jets or designer suits, but as a man who wanted to learn. He spent months in the village, working alongside her, understanding the land, the people, the struggles they faced every day. He chopped wood, carried water, and even attempted to hunt, though he was still terrible at it. And in that time, Emily saw it. This wasn't a game to him. He had truly changed. One evening, as they stood by the river, watching the northern lights dance across the sky, Richard turned to her. "Emily," he said, voice steady, "can I stay?" She looked at him. The man who had once been lost, broken, betrayed. The man who had rebuilt himself, not with wealth, but with something far greater. A man who had finally found his way home. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. "Yeah," she whispered, "you can stay." And as the lights shimmered above them, Emily knew this was just the beginning. Richard had found something far more valuable than money. He had found purpose, love, and a place to truly belong. Emily, the girl who once saved a stranger in the snow, had unknowingly saved a lost soul searching for something he never knew he needed. Together, They built a life that bridged two worlds, one of untamed wilderness, the other of towering skyscrapers. But in the end, it wasn't the wealth or power that mattered. It was the simple moments, the quiet love, and the realization that true riches don't come from what we own, but from the people who stand beside us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more heartfelt tales that inspire and uplift. Let us bring you more stories of love, resilience, and the unexpected beauty of human connection. Until next time, stay warm, stay hopeful, and always believe in the kindness of strangers.